For years, the world's most dangerous criminals believed they had found the perfect shield. A phone that could not be traced, messages that could not be read. A network that promised absolute secrecy. Drug traffickers coordinated shipments worth millions. Assassins discussed targets in plain text. Cartel leaders planned executions, confident that no one was listening. We want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Comment below and subscribe. But they were wrong. What these criminals didn't know was that the very device they trusted most was designed by law enforcement. Every message they sent, every order they gave, every crime they planned, it was all being read in real time. This was not a hack, it was not a leak, it was not a lucky break, it was one of the most sophisticated undercover operations in history. An operation where the FBI and international partners didn't chase criminals through encrypted networks, they built the network themselves. For 3 years, the global underworld spoke freely, unaware that they were talking into a trap called ANÜM. What followed would lead to thousands of arrests, the collapse of major crime syndicates, and a permanent shift in how law enforcement fights organized crime in the digital age. This is the story of how the world's most secure criminal communication platform became its greatest betrayal. For decades, law enforcement relied on the same basic methods to fight organized crime: wiretaps, informants, physical surveillance. And for a long time, they worked, but as technology evolved, criminal networks evolved faster. By the early 2010s, smartphones had become powerful tools not just for ordinary people, but for the global underworld. Encrypted messaging apps allowed criminals to communicate instantly, across borders, with little fear of interception. Traditional phone taps became useless. A message could be sent from Europe to South America in seconds, protected by layers of encryption that even intelligence agencies struggled to break. Drug cartels coordinated international shipments. Human traffickers moved victims across continents. Hitmen received contracts with a few taps on a screen. To law enforcement, it felt like criminals had gone dark. This problem wasn't limited to one country. Police agencies around the world were facing the same wall, conversations they knew were happening, but could no longer hear. End-to-end encryption had become the gold standard not just for privacy advocates, but for organized crime, and the criminals knew it. They actively avoided mainstream apps. They distrusted consumer technology. They wanted tools built specifically for them. This demand created an underground market for secure communication devices, phones that looked ordinary on the outside, but were stripped down, hardened, and modified for secrecy. To criminals, these devices meant freedom. To law enforcement, they represented a growing blind spot. And unless that blind spot could be eliminated, the balance of power was shifting away from the authorities and toward the underworld. As criminals searched for absolute secrecy, one company rose above all others. Phantom Secure. On the surface, it looked like a legitimate technology business. In reality, it sold heavily modified smartphones designed for one purpose only: to keep criminals hidden. These phones had no cameras, no microphones, no GPS. They couldn't browse the internet. They couldn't install apps. They could only do one thing: send encrypted messages. And for years, Phantom Secure became the gold standard of criminal communication. Drug traffickers trusted it. Gang leaders relied on it. International crime syndicates built their operations around it. But what made Phantom Secure successful also made it vulnerable. Because it wasn't just criminals paying attention. Law enforcement had been watching closely. Behind the scenes, investigators began mapping the network, tracking devices, identifying users, and slowly building a case. Not by breaking the encryption, but by following the people behind the phones. In 2018, everything collapsed. The CEO of Phantom Secure was arrested and charged with facilitating organized crime. Prosecutors argued that the company didn't just sell phones, it knowingly enabled drug trafficking, money laundering, and violent crime on a global scale. The arrest sent shockwaves through the underworld. Overnight, the most trusted communication platform disappeared. For criminals, it was a disaster. Their secure channel was gone, their operations were exposed. And they desperately needed a replacement. What they didn't realize was that this sudden collapse had created an opportunity. Not for criminals, but for law enforcement. And in that vacuum, a new idea was about to emerge, one far more dangerous than anything that came before. When Phantom Secure collapsed, the criminal underworld was thrown into chaos. Years of trusted communication vanished overnight. Networks were exposed, paranoia spread. For law enforcement, this moment was critical. They knew criminals would not abandon encrypted communication. They would replace it. The question was how. Instead of chasing the next encrypted platform, investigators made a radical decision. They would create it themselves. Behind closed doors, the FBI, working closely with the Australian Federal Police, began developing a new encrypted communication system. It looked exactly like what criminals wanted: a stripped-down smartphone. No cameras, no GPS, no internet access, just encrypted messaging. The device was called ANØM. To the underworld, ANGM appeared to be a secure successor to Phantom Secure. To law enforcement, it was something else entirely. Built into the system was a silent access point, one that allowed authorities to read every message sent across the network, not by cracking encryption after the fact, but by receiving the messages as they were sent, legally, systematically, in real time. This was not surveillance in the traditional sense. It was infiltration at the infrastructure level. But ANØM had one major problem. Criminals don't trust new technology. To succeed, the platform needed credibility, endorsement from inside the underworld itself. So law enforcement turned to confidential informants, individuals already embedded in criminal networks, to quietly promote the device. ANØM wasn't advertised, it wasn't sold openly. It was introduced through whispers, trusted contacts, personal recommendations, word of mouth. Slowly, the phones began to spread. And with every new user, the trap grew larger. Criminals believed they were regaining control. They believed they were safe again. In reality, they were voluntarily walking into one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations ever conducted. In the criminal underworld, technology is never trusted blindly. Reputation matters, history matters. And above all, who introduces you matters. Law enforcement understood this. ANGM could not spread like a normal product. It had to be validated from within. The phones were distributed through carefully selected intermediaries, criminal figures who already had credibility. Some were confidential informants, others were individuals, quietly cooperating to reduce their own sentences. To everyone else, they appeared legitimate. They spoke the right language, they shared the same risks. They had nothing to gain by lying, at least. That's what it looked like. ANGM was positioned as exclusive, expensive, hard to get. Exactly what serious criminals expect. The software itself reinforced that illusion. Messages were encrypted, usernames replaced real identities. Phones could only communicate with other ANGM devices, creating a closed ecosystem that felt secure and professional. And there was one critical rule. ANGM phones were not for small-time criminals. They were recommended only to trusted, high-level players, drug traffickers, arms dealers, cartel operatives. The kind of people who valued security over convenience. That strategy worked. As influential criminals adopted ANGM, others followed. Trust spread horizontally, not vertically. No ads, no branding. Just confirmation from people whose lives depended on secrecy. Within months, ANØM devices appeared in dozens of countries. Criminals coordinated drug shipments across oceans. They discussed kidnappings and murders. They negotiated prices, routes, and payments confident that their conversations were invisible. What made ANGM so effective wasn't the technology, it was psychology. Criminals trusted ANGM because it felt earned, not sold. And every message they sent only deepened the illusion, while silently delivering intelligence to the very agencies they were trying to evade. If you're amazed so far, hit like and comment your thoughts. Once ANGM reached critical mass, something unprecedented happened. The global underworld began speaking freely. Criminals no longer coded their messages. They no longer avoided details. They no longer assumed someone might be listening. They believed ANØM was unbreakable. Across more than 100 countries, thousands of criminal users sent millions of messages laying out their operations in plain language. Drug shipments were scheduled down to the hour. Container numbers were shared, drop-off locations were pinned. Murder plots were discussed with chilling precision. Names, addresses, timelines. To the criminals, these were private conversations. To law enforcement, it was a live feed into the inner workings of organized crime. Special task forces worked around the clock, reading messages as they arrived. Investigators didn't need to guess intent or piece together fragments. They were watching crimes being planned in real time. In some cases, this intelligence saved lives. Planned executions were disrupted, kidnappings were prevented. Drug shipments were intercepted before reaching the street. What made ANØM especially powerful was its scale. This wasn't a single informant, it wasn't a wiretap on one suspect. It was an entire criminal ecosystem, exposing itself voluntarily. Messages revealed alliances between gangs that law enforcement never knew existed. They uncovered supply chains stretching from South America to Europe, from Asia to Australia. Every conversation added context. Every reply filled in gaps, and criminals had no idea. The very feature they trusted most, end-to-end encryption, became irrelevant. Authorities weren't breaking the encryption, they were included. By the time criminals began to sense something was wrong, it was already too late. Years of evidence had been collected, logged, and legally preserved. ANØM had become the most effective listening device in law enforcement history. And the final phase of the operation was approaching. By mid-2021, law enforcement had everything they needed. Years of conversations, clear hierarchies, verified identities, and evidence strong enough to stand in court. The only thing left was timing. The operation was known as Trojan Shield, and it would be executed simultaneously, across the globe. In a carefully coordinated effort, law enforcement agencies in dozens of countries prepared for the largest synchronized takedown in modern history. Warrants were sealed, teams were briefed, targets were identified down to the minute. Then, the signal was given. Raids began almost at the same time in cities across Europe, North America, South America, Asia, and Australia. Doors were breached, phones were seized. Suspects were arrested, many of them still holding the ANØM devices they trusted. Some were caught mid-conversation, others were arrested before crimes they had openly discussed could be carried out. The scale was staggering, more than 800 arrests worldwide. Tons of narcotics seized, dozens of weapons confiscated. Millions in cash recovered. Major crime syndicates collapsed overnight. In Australia alone, authorities dismantled entire drug networks. In Europe, high-level traffickers were taken off the streets. In the Americas, International supply chains were broken at multiple points. For many criminals, the arrests made no sense. Their phones hadn't been hacked, their encryption hadn't failed. They didn't yet understand the truth. Only later would they learn that their most trusted tool had been controlled by law enforcement from the very beginning. Trojan Shield didn't just result in arrests, it rewrote the rules. For the first time, authorities had proven they didn't need to break encrypted systems to defeat them. They could build them, and with that realization, a chapter of criminal history closed. While a new era of digital surveillance quietly began. As the scale of Operation Trojan Shield became public, reactions were immediate and divided. For law enforcement, ANÜM was a historic success. For critics, it raised serious questions. At the center of the controversy was a simple issue: how far should governments be allowed to go in the name of security? Authorities had not merely intercepted communications. They had created the platform, they had invited criminals onto it, and they had listened to every message from the start. Civil liberties groups argued that this crossed a line. Was it entrapment? Was it mass surveillance? Did it violate privacy laws, especially when messages crossed international borders? Courts in several countries were forced to examine these questions. Defense attorneys challenged the legality of the evidence, arguing that users had been deceived into incriminating themselves. Prosecutors responded with a different view. ANÜM users were not ordinary citizens. They were experienced criminals, actively seeking tools to commit serious crimes. And no one had forced them to use the devices. In many cases, courts agreed. Judges ruled that the operation was lawful, proportionate, and targeted at organized crime, not the general public. The evidence stood, but the debate did not end there. Cybersecurity experts warned that ANÜM set a dangerous precedent. If governments could secretly operate encrypted platforms, how could anyone trust secure communication systems in the future? The operation exposed a deeper tension between privacy and public safety, between digital freedom and law enforcement power. ANÜM had stopped crimes and saved lives, but it had also changed expectations. From that moment on, criminals and privacy advocates alike had to confront a new reality. Encryption alone was no longer a guarantee of safety. ANÜM was never just an undercover operation. It was a proof of concept. For decades, law enforcement had been locked in a technological arms race with organized crime always reacting, always trying to catch up. ANÜM changed that dynamic. Instead of breaking encrypted systems, authorities built one. Instead of chasing criminals through digital shadows, they invited them into the light without them realizing it. The operation demonstrated a new strategy: infiltration over confrontation. Criminal networks that once believed they were untouchable learned a harsh lesson. Their greatest strength, secrecy, could be turned against them. But the impact of ANÜM extends far beyond the arrests. It forced criminal organizations to question every communication tool they use. It pushed them toward paranoia and fragmentation. And it reshaped how trust functions in the underworld. At the same time, it sent a clear message to law enforcement agencies worldwide: innovation matters, patience matters, and sometimes, the most effective way to dismantle a system is to become part of it. ANÜM closed one chapter in the history of organized crime, but it opened another one where the battlefield is invisible, the weapons are digital, and the war is fought long before a single arrest is made. This was not just a sting operation. It was a turning point. What do you think about this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Support the channel by subscribing and sharing this story with your friends. It helps a lot.